I'm Arav. I'm a student at Northwestern University, and today I'm delighted to host Jyotsna Dhar, also known as Joy. Joy is a first year PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as a therapist.
Thanks for that intro, Adav, and Namaskar, Maharaj. My name is Jyotsna Dhar, as Adav said. My nickname is Joy in the Western world. My family name is Gongposh, so I think I identify with many ways of referring to myself, but I am a first year doc student in the counseling psychology department at University of Wisconsin-Madison, go Badgers. And I just wrapped up my master's in clinical mental health counseling in Chicago at Northwestern, where I practice and run some groups right now. And then prior to that, I was a federal consultant actually in DC and studied international affairs and journalism at George Washington University. So it's been a bit of a winding road path, but I'm happy to be here talking about mental health in the community today.
This is Season 2, Episode 3, Nurturing Heritage and Mental Health.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing with that with us. And sort of to shift, to our first segment, I want to start off with talk about Navreh. Navreh is going to be tomorrow, at least at the time that we're recording this. I think by the time it'll come out, you guys will be amidst Navratri. So I'm just sort of curious about, your memories of celebrating Navreh at home and, just some of the traditions that you can remember, some of the, how your family sort of emphasized why it's a special day in the household. If you can kind of talk about that.
Sure. So I will say that most of my memories around Navreh are between maybe 10 and 17. I moved to the East Coast when I was 17, and I don't remember, as many people don't, the very, very early years. But I can imagine that for my family that was living in Delhi at the time, we moved to the States when I was 5, that some of the traditions that we had were probably a little bit, different because there was just more community around us, more family, things of that nature. But I remember we would have to wake up extra early for school on the morning of Navreh and look at the thali, and there would be rice and there'd be a dollar. And I can't remember if we used to sign the dollar or sign another sheet of paper, but I remember always being worried that the money would not be usable if we signed the dollar. So that's where my anxiety origin story started. Just kidding. But yeah, I don't think I started really having my own relationship or understanding around Navreh beyond kind of the rituals that we would do at home until I got to college, and there really wasn't someone forcing me to wake up in the morning and look at this plate and try and explain to me what this means culturally. So that's when my own individual meaning making process started to happen around this. And while I don't always participate in much of the ritual aspect around this particular celebration unless I'm at home, for me, Navreh has become a moment or a series of moments to really honor the root of the tradition, which is honoring the divine feminine. Taking a moment to really think about that in the context of the different ways that it shows up in the culture, in the ways that it shows up in my family, in the ways that it shows up in the community. And another favorite part that I like around this is that Navreh, well, I that because of the latter part that I said, because that's kind of the whole idea of Navratri, and then the idea of having a new year celebration that kind of aligns with the astrological calendar, as well as kind of the ways that the seasons are changing. Feels like a way of connecting this spiritual practice as well as what I'm seeing around me in nature. So that I find to be something that's grounding around this time of year, around Navreh, and then also really just getting to enjoy. I went to school with people of a lot of different faiths and international backgrounds, and so really getting to enjoy this time of year where a lot of people from many religious, spiritual traditions are celebrating, bless you, spring
Thank you.
or a harvest. Baisakhi, we have Nowruz, which is Persian New Year. We have Easter. We have often people celebrating Eid around this time of year as well. So it's, I think, collectively just an exciting time of renewal. And that's kind of what I've come to appreciate it as you know, a millennial in the diaspora.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very, very lovely answer. I do want to touch upon a few things you said. First, where you said your family moved here when you were 5.
Mhm.
So were you born in Delhi?
Yes, I was born in Delhi. We lived there in West Delhi mostly until we moved to good old Naperville, Illinois. Shout out Naperville. And that's where my family still is. So I did K through 12 in Naperville, and then I moved to DC.
Very nice. I think it's interesting because I was also born in Mumbai. So if
Mhm.
anyone wants to say there's some ABCDs or American born confused ACs talking here, they would be completely incorrect. Both of these two are straight from the motherland. Um, the other thing I wanted to talk about was I loved how you talked about the thali. I think that's something every Kashmiri kid growing up, you know, like remembers as that being sort of a core memory about this holiday. I can remember my experience with it. Each year my writing on the paper got a little more accurate of what the ohm should actually look like. So that was always really interesting to look back at. And I think it's a very nice tradition. It feels like, it's something special in a really cool way to start the year. Um, I do want to take this topic and sort of transition it a little bit more into the mental health side of things. And I think, especially for our parents' generations, do you think, like, how do you think celebrating these events properly and doing it right was, important for their well-being and connecting to the culture,
Mhm.
in sort of like an emotional mental health sort of regard?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I also, before I actually answer your question, something I'm sitting with in the question itself is
Sure, sure.
this idea of doing it right. And I know sometimes, even just in how we described our own customs, our own family customs, probably not that many miles away from each other because I know we grew up
Right.
with um they sound like there were some nuances that were a little bit different. And if my mom listens to this and she's like, oh my God, we didn't do that, or like she didn't remember this, etc., all this stuff, that could be just me as a person. But also I do know that there's just through the years become so much variability in some of the nuances around this tradition. So for some families, doing it right might mean one thing, for other families, doing it right might mean another thing. And I know so for me, when I hear your question, I think it's less about doing the traditions or rituals in a right way, but doing it in a way that feels valuable to the individual and to the system that they're in. So whether it's that family, whether it's one particular ancestral lineage that does one particular practice, and um, that being the source of really honoring that cultural tradition and gathering in community for that, and finding meaning and significance in that, I think can be really valuable for mental health, more than the ability to do something in one way all the time across every context and every family. But I think it speaks to a broader idea of especially for communities that in this country are referred to as minorities, but just minority communities across the globe, the ability to maintain a semblance of community and a semblance of to do with those emotions based on how it's affecting other parts of their lives.
Yeah, definitely. I guess sort of now getting into the meat of it, I guess how do you think all this sort of trauma of our community's genocide, like, what is how are people is there a certain way, people are supposed to treat that internally in their heads? Is there a right or wrong way to think about what's happened? Um, or is everything okay and people should be, sort of willing to like understand that any sort of emotions and this sort of traumatic experience are okay to have. Just like overall, I guess, trying to connect people's mental health to this sort of traumatic experience. Do you have just any general thoughts on that, maybe?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. I think so many of those thoughts, and I don't know if I have concrete answers.
Of course, yeah,
So I'll,
sure.
I'll give you where I'm kind of stirring in my brain with this right now. I will say, grappling with some of what has happened in the community, what I've seen happen as a result of like not processing a lot of what has happened in the community, um, is something that really started to stir my spidey senses, if you will, and was a huge motivator of me thinking about what I was going to do after like actively wanting to leave consulting. I don't have answers because everybody, like, we have seen so many different responses to displacement that has happened within our community. I don't know if I have the authority, or if anyone really has the authority to say what is right and what is wrong. From my perspective as, you know, a human agnostic of being a therapist or a student in the field, is that there are, yeah, I think because of the different contexts that people were in, people are just going to have different responses to what happened. I think that starts with the fact that people have a lot of different stories around what happened. Some people experienced the trauma of migration in ways that resulted in loss of life of immediate family members. Some people experienced it in kind of like a vicarious trauma type way. So maybe they weren't on the ground when something happened, or something happened to their immediate family member, but they have heard about it and have been living with it for so long. You know, my parents have not been back to Kashmir in 30 years. I've never been to Kashmir myself. And then I think there's long-standing effects beyond just the acute migration for different people. Some people left before 1990s. Some people, and that's affected their own identity of what it means to be Kashmiri, and what it means to navigate that identity in their individual contexts. Other people moved to a Western country, other people moved to India. So the amount of supports that they had within their own community, if they were trying to seek more of a Kashmiri community, were going to be different. I know we're lucky that in the Chicagoland area, there's a pretty large Kashmiri Hindu community. That's not the case in every state in the country. That's not the case in every country in the world. So the idea of being able to even find other people to relate to your experience and to find some healing communally just by being together and celebrating some of these traditions and rituals that we were talking about has varied for different people, and has been one thing that has it obviously is variable in how people respond to what has happened. Then there's also so many individual factors. People have different personalities, people have different coping strategies themselves. People have different financial realities about the support that they can seek, about what material realities look like for them. Like, were their families in refugee camps, or were people able to leave due to having family elsewhere, or means in other ways. So I think it's hard to answer. I know we got a little bit from the question that you asked, but I
No
think it's
worries, no worries.
answer it is because everybody has so many different contexts, and that has resulted in different like factors that people are dealing with when they're even thinking about their own identity as a Kashmiri, and the different levels of trauma that maybe they're carrying intergenerationally.
Sure. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think what we can see is that a common line is everyone who is sort of feels connected to it it's definitely negatively affected their, headspace, or it takes up a lot of their headspace. And I wanted to ask you now, um, if there's any, coping mechanisms that maybe or strategies that you've seen have worked or that you would recommend, maybe obviously not as like a professional or anything, or like just from your sort of point of view for dealing with this sort of, trauma, whether it's, maybe professional help or just sort of things you can do on your own.
Yeah, so I mean, great point. I can't give professional advice on um a podcast. I don't think my supervisor would like that very much. But
Yes.
I
Yes.
so I appreciate that caveat, but I think again, like it's going to depend on what people have, excuse me, what people have access to. I know I didn't really like going to Kashmiri functions when I was younger because it felt like, oh, I want to do my homework instead. Not that I ever really wanted to do my homework, but at times it's like, I would rather do my homework than like, I don't know, whatever. And yet now I'm at a place, and I think this changed when I went to college and didn't really have as easy access to what really felt like a really rich community support system anymore, is that I actively seek out these opportunities to be in community and to navigate the identity as a 1.5 generation like child of immigrants here. I think community is a big piece because isolation, as we have seen time and time again, both through so many cultural backgrounds, but also just a lot of psychological and medical research that's coming out now, is that isolation is incredibly deadly for people. And so to be isolated with something that is so painful, and that can be so confusing because there isn't always an exact answer on how to navigate what you're sitting with in regards to an identity like this. Yeah, having community, having people that see you and your experience as a balm, even if you don't agree with ways things should move forward or things like that, can be incredibly powerful because it decreases the isolation. And then to your point about seeking professional help, I'm biased. I'm a therapist. I think I had extreme biases towards therapy before I ended up in therapy myself, and I fully recognize that some of the stigma is so real, and there's so many things that we hear about it and so many things that we're told about it. And therapy was such a game changer for me, not because I think if you're a parent listening to this, I'm sure on some level, maybe my parents were like, what is this girl doing in therapy? Is she just complaining about me all the time? That's not really what was happening. I think it just is a place where you can be seen for what you are. And I think regardless of having a really complicated identity, being a person from a displaced background and a displaced community, and a displaced community that has, in some cases, like ours, like resettled in another country. There are even beyond that, carrying these legacies of what happened to parents, what happened to grandparents, what happened to generally the community, and being separate from that can be, it was just a great place to kind of be seen in those parts and learn how to process it, learn how to make and some sort of understanding of what that identity means for you. But beyond that, it's not just the understanding the identity piece. For many people, this has resulted in extreme anxiety, extreme hypervigilance, like being on guard all the time, lots of tension in all parts of the body, chronic pain. Like I can't, we don't have
right.
this in front of us, so I can't be like this and this and this. But there are chances that people are really navigating this. And I've heard a lot of personal anecdotes of people navigating a lot of these varied health struggles within the community, and not having, we do know from research and from so many traditions, this is a longstanding in many spiritual and cultural traditions, a longstanding idea that there is a mind-body connection. So if your mind is navigating these unresolved pieces of deep trauma and pain, your body is going to feel it, and vice versa. So just therapy can be another tool to just navigate some of these other pieces that are coming up that way. So this is my long-winded answer of saying, yeah, if you have the ability, if you have the means to seek out professional support, I would 200% recommend it. There are free resources to get professional help from a counselor or from a psychologist or from a social worker that does therapy so many different ways. Group therapy can be a cheaper modality that can be more affordable sometimes. Yeah, and talking to your primary care physician if you have one and it feels comfortable to do that, about even exploring the idea of getting this care, or talking to another someone that that has had access to this. But therapy is not the only healing tool. I think sometimes people are told that mental health problems can only be solved by going to therapy. That is a super Western model. I think people have their own ways of it. It is an extremely resilient community, and people have their own coping skills that I would encourage them to tap into. Breathing exercises, different, calling friends, processing things with trusted individuals, having not just one thing, but kind of a toolkit of spiritual practices, of professional help, of community, I think can be helpful to ease some pain and make sense of how to show up.
Yeah, I think that was really, really great answer. I think obviously therapy comes to mind right away as sort of the first thing in terms of how to go about solving this, but I think it was great that you highlighted some other examples, especially to me. I think the community one really will resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Just having that support system around you, I'm sure can really, change what's going on in your head and improve that sort of space
Yeah.
quite significantly. And I guess the last sort of, structured question we have here for you today, as someone, in this sort of first generation of Kashmiri Indian Americans, any just sort of challenges you feel like you faced growing up, not maybe, understanding what exactly has happened to your community, just sort of any challenges you faced, and kind of how that has affected you growing up.
I think that's a meaty question, as all of these have been. But
Sure, yeah.
I think for me, I don't know how many other people really have experienced it this way, because I don't think I've talked
Right.
to people in the community about this. Is my brother, who is forced to listen to me talk to him about this. That's in his job description as a little brother.
Mhm.
I have experienced my Indian American identity separate from my Kashmiri identity, because I think, at least in Indian American spaces I've been, a lot of people have not known, had never met a Kashmiri person before, had no idea,
Yeah,
um,
definitely.
had no idea that we spoke a different language, had no idea that we didn't necessarily have a script for the language. Didn't know that many of us ate meat, didn't know that, that there was so much diversity in tradition. I think a lot of people also didn't know that many people were forced to leave Kashmir for a variety of reasons. Other people didn't know that there was a time that Muslims and Hindus and people of other religions, like, often, not in every single regard, but did coexist together. So there was just a lot of stories that people did not know or understand. And I think a level of complexity of this idea of a different type of minoritization and that type of experience that I think I don't know personally, because I'd never lived in Kashmir, but that I'd heard from my parents, and navigating what life was like in a system that is different in many ways compared to the rest of maybe people that speak Hindi or people that identify as Hindu and things like that. So I think when I started to just kind of accept that these were going to be different pieces, and even the fact that like some of what I'd been told and my parents' experiences as Kashmiri people, like both my parents have different experiences. Both their parents have different experiences of living in Kashmir, of leaving Kashmir, happened for different reasons, things like that. Even within the community, honoring like, yeah, we can have a lot of different experiences. That's just a reality. Doesn't mean that one person's is better or one person's is worse. And same within the Indian American experience. Like I actually don't have to try and get my experience to conform with this broader narrative of what it means to be an Indian American. Yeah, I think when I started to, and I think that's really only happened within the last few years, when I started to really allow that to happen, it became a little bit easier to accept these different pieces that sometimes feel like they can be contradicting and confusing.
Yeah. I guess just to sort of wrap it up, I'd like to give you the chance. I know I was giving you a lot of the questions. If there's any, final thoughts or maybe advice for listeners, especially from those from the Kashmiri Pandit community, or maybe, if there's one or two really things that if they're taking away nothing else, that's sort of what you want to take them away. I'll give you the floor for that.
Sure. I mean, as you've probably learned in this podcast recording, I talk a lot, so I will try to keep it brief and pick only a few things. But
Sure.
um,
Yes.
yeah, I think the biggest thing is don't be afraid to ask for help. Asking for help is not a weakness. The community has gone through a lot, and regardless of what generation you're in and what your exact experience of it is, like the intergenerational transmission of trauma and pain is very real and can stay stored in the body and in the mind. So asking for help is a brave thing to do. And yeah, getting therapy is great. And I would totally, recommend that to everybody in the world. And I'm not just saying that because that's one of the ways that I get paid. And I would just remind people that, that you have, in addition to therapy or in addition to like other Western medicine and types of care, you have your own internal resources. So community is one of them. All of these other practices that you use to kind of ground yourself and give yourself comfort are also important to remember and use.
Yeah. Just thank you for coming on our podcast, Joy. Thank you for taking the time out. This was really, really great. It was great to discuss some of those Navreh traditions with you, and then the meat of our discussion being around mental health and how that is sort of affecting our community. I think was fantastic and something that isn't talked a lot about, or enough also at all, within our circles. Thank you for tuning in. Please follow us on Instagram and TikTok at KOA Youth to keep up with some more of our podcasts. They'll be coming out this year on a monthly basis. And feel free to DM us if you'd also like to be brought on and talk about something specific. We'd love for, more active participation from, listeners and viewers. Once again, thank you again so much, Joy, and namaskar from me, Arav.
Namaskar.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Everything Koshur. You can listen to our previous and future episodes on all podcasting platforms. Please make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to get notified of when our future episodes release. Thank you, and we will see you next time on Everything Koshur.